like to welcome all of you this evening to our event. My name is Michael Buddy. I'm Professor of Catholic Studies and Political Science here at DePaul University. I'm also a research scholar affiliated with the Center for World Catholicism and Intercultural Theology, which is a research institute sponsored by DePaul that focuses on the global church with particular emphasis on the church in the so-called Global South. It's a great pleasure to have you here this evening. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the program of which our event this evening is a part, and then a couple of other things that may be of interest to you before I introduce our speaker. This is part of a year-long series of events built around what in the Christian tradition are called the corporal works of mercy. Clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, giving drink to the thirsty, sheltering the homeless, visiting the prisoners, so on. There will be a series of events throughout the academic year looking at different aspects of what it means to be church and what it means to practice the works of mercy in a world with a seemingly limitless number of challenges, problems, but occasionally also opportunities. Part of that series after this evening, the next installment arrives on Thursday, October 19th, speaking on a particular set of questions related to feeding the hungry and giving drink to the thirsty. We're welcoming Chris Herlinger, who's an international correspondent for a variety of publications in the United States and abroad. He'll be speaking on the topic of the challenges in Haiti and South Sudan. Chris does extensive field reporting and has had lengthy engagements with problems, challenges, and crises, as well as the responses of community people and outside supporters from around the world. That's Thursday, October 19, a reception at 6:30 p.m., presentation at 7, coincidentally enough, in this very same room. Admission is free. You're all invited to join. Later in this academic year, not part of this series, the Department of Catholic Studies at DePaul is sponsoring a major presentation entitled Martin Luther, the Reformation, and Why They Still Matter, featuring one of the preeminent scholars of Reformation history, Brad Gregory, the Griffin Professor of Early Modern European History at the University of Notre Dame. That lecture is Tuesday, October 24th, 6:30 p.m. in room 161 of the Schmidt Academic Center. Later in the fall, see, we're a busy place. You're going to have to keep score. We're pleased to welcome one of the scholars in residence that the center is hosting this year, and that's Professor Paul Coleman, who's a Holy Cross priest from the University of Notre Dame, who's the director of that institution's Center for Social Concerns. He's among the leading scholars on Christianity and social issues in East Africa. He'll be speaking to us on Thursday, November 9, on the topic of Africa's contributions to the Catholic Church, past, present, and future. Again, 6:30 p.m., coincidentally enough, this same room. We must like this room. On to the evening's topics of concern and interest. You may see that there's at least one organization, and there's some various materials in the back. Later, before the question time, we'll hear from a representative from Catholic Relief Services talking about a brand new initiative launched by Pope Francis, effective yesterday, which is pretty good. The Pope couldn't be here, so he sent his most trusted associate.
I'm very thankful that the Pope timed that announcement with this speech.
Well, it was nice that you made him embargo the thing until you got here.
It's very thoughtful.
Over to my left is Kevin Clarke. Kevin is senior editor and chief correspondent for America magazine, a publication by the U.S. Jesuits based in New York City, but with a mandate to cover religion, society, politics, culture, the arts, with a worldwide mandate in many respects. Kevin is one of those uncommonly gifted people who understands the complexity of contemporary problems as well as historical context, and blends that with the capacity to present difficult things in ways that all of us can understand, in ways that provide not only information but sense of significance, purpose, and opportunities. He's worked for and has been a media consultant for a variety of different publications. He refuses to give us much of a formal biography, so what you have on your chairs is what he gave us. He's really entirely too humble. I am going to boast on his behalf. He's a graduate of DePaul University. He received his MA here in International Studies.
After much struggle.
Per aspera ad aspera, as they say. So Kevin will be speaking to us this evening on the question of refugees, migration, and human movement. We'll have a brief response to Kevin's remarks, we're happy to say, from Musa Mukame. Musa is a master's student at DePaul University in one of our newer graduate programs, in the program in Refugee Studies and Forced Migration. She brings a rich academic and activist background to bear on her studies and on our time this evening. She's a graduate of the University of Zimbabwe, studying psychology there. She's done extensive work in nonprofits and human rights work in the United States. And she has particular interest in questions of refugees and displacement and the response of international policymakers. So after Kevin speaks, Mutsa will give us some more food for thought, and then we will open up for conversation and questions. So please join me. We're very pleased to have him with us tonight, Kevin Buck.
I don't know if I project as well as Michael. Is this microphone working? Yes. Okay. Just a note of information. These are pictures I took in the Central African Republic a few years ago when I was doing a reporting job there. The only reason you're seeing these, they have absolutely no direct connection to my speech, but I don't often speak publicly like this, but I've done it on occasion, and I found that being up here prattling on for half an hour can be a difficult thing for you folks to experience. So I thought if it gets really bad and you're feeling like taking a nap, you could instead turn and just meditate prayerfully on the folks here. Most of these people you're going to be seeing I encountered them in internally displaced people's camps in the capital Bangui or outside the capital. Most of the people here just barely got out alive from the conflict there in 2014, and they were living under extremely dire circumstances. Most of them were Christian at camps in Bangui. Some of them are Muslim who were taking refuge in the city's main mosque, which at the time was surrounded and in a very precarious, and still is. It's been years, but really not much has changed in the situation there. So if I get too tedious, by all means, feel free to just contemplate and prayerfully meditate on these folks here. Not that I'm planning to get too tedious, I'll try to keep this. So we're going to talk a little bit about the worldwide refugee crisis, really a crisis of migration, I should say. Should I do something? Okay, I'm fine. All right, good. And what our church, what our society is trying to do about it. In July 2013, Pope Francis went to Lampedusa, which is a small island in the Mediterranean Sea near Sicily. Lampedusa had become an unwilling repository of a historic human suffering. Even as the Catholic world was wondering what kind of pope this Argentinian Jesuit would prove to be, Francis was planning this Mass at Lampedusa. Significantly, it would be his first celebration of the Mass outside of the Vatican, and one of the first public acts of his papacy. The island had become a focal point of a vast tragedy, the scope of which had yet to be fully grasped. During his homily, the Pope explained how watching images of immigrants dying at sea in boats which were vehicles of hope but became vehicles of death had impressed on him an urgency to go and speak at Lampedusa. The awareness that hundreds of these deaths happen outside the scope of the media cameras all too frequently without anyone noticing, the Pope said, came to him like a painful thorn in my heart. So I felt I had to come here to pray and to offer a sign of my closeness, but also to challenge our consciences lest this tragedy be repeated. Please let it not be repeated. That's what he said in 2013. That was more than 4 years ago, when we still might have had a chance, some semblance of confidence that the civilized world would appropriately gather itself to humanely address this unprecedented challenge. Like the thousands landing on Lampedusa's coast, millions of other people were on the move around the world in 2013, in what has become the largest migration of humanity since the end of World War II. This Mass was celebrated just before the population of refugees that were floating across the Mediterranean, many were from North Africa at the time, they would begin to be replaced by Palestinians fleeing a ruined Gaza, Iraqis and Syrians fleeing their desolated and dangerous nations. Many of those attending the Mass were not Catholic, they were not even Christian. Pope Francis specifically acknowledged their presence. Wishing them a spiritually renewing Ramadan beginning that day, he told them, "The Church is at your side as you seek a more dignified life for yourselves and your families." And he thanked the people of Lampedusa for taking these desperate people in and setting an example of human solidarity in the face of what he called the globalization of indifference. Now, you probably heard him say this phrase since then. He's used it a lot. He's condemned economic idolatry with it, radical indifference to ecological threats, and to condemn a throwaway society that is as comfortable tossing out blemished food while the world hungers as it is with discarding people as technological or economic interests shift. I think it is telling that the first time he deployed that memorable phrase, however, it was to deplore what was becoming evident in 2013, a nearly inhuman inattention to this global catastrophe of migration and to the criminal enterprises that were growing up around it and the resentful nativism and xenophobia it was provoking. In Lampedusa, Pope Francis said there were two questions that God asks at the dawn of human history. Adam, where are you? As humankind, seeing creation as something to possess and to exhaust, first removes himself from the garden. And where is your brother? As violence and indifference are introduced into the world, two questions which trouble us to this day. At Lampedusa, Pope Francis asks a third question. Why can't we weep? Has any of us grieved for the death of these brothers and sisters, he asked during the homily at that Mass, speaking of migrants who disappeared on the sea or washed up on the Mediterranean shores. Has any of us wept for these persons who were on the boat, for the young mothers carrying their babies, for these men who were looking for a means of supporting their families? We are a society which has forgotten how to weep, the Pope said, how to experience compassion and suffering with others. The globalization of indifference, and there's the phrase, has taken from us the ability to weep. 4 years later, many of us, though we may regret the suffering we encounter in newspaper, cable TV, and internet video, still remain detached from the suffering of migrants and refugees, unable to weep. According to the United Nations, over the past 2 decades, the global population of forcibly displaced people, that is, as refugees, people driven from their home countries across border into a different country, or as displaced persons, people internally displaced, moved from their villages to a safe zone within their own borders. That number has grown from 34 million in 1997 to some 66 million people in 2016. 10.3 million people were uprooted from their homes just last year. Less than 600,000 refugees returned to their countries of origin in 2016, and many under circumstances in which their safety and social reintegration were seriously doubtful. Some specific countries have been especially affected by forced displacement in 2016. People of Syria continue to be the largest forcibly displaced population in the world. 12 million people have been uprooted there at the end of 2016. Colombians, this is kind of a forgotten internally displaced people crisis, they're the second largest group with 7 million people internally displaced in Colombia. 5 million Afghans have been forcibly displaced. Other large numbers come from a familiar litany of nations where suffering has been well known in recent years. Iraq, 4.2 million, South Sudan, 3.3 million, Sudan, 2.9 million. The Democratic Republic of the Congo, 2.9 million. Somalia, 2.6 million. Nigeria, 2.5. Ukraine, 2.1. And Yemen, 2.1 million people. Half of these people who have been displaced or are refugees are children. Sometimes these are children who join the refugee trail unaccompanied or separated from their families. Children acutely at risk of exploitation and abuse, even when they arrive at presumed safe harbors in Europe. These big numbers only represent people who have been forcibly relocated because of conflict or broad violence in their societies. They do not include millions more who are merely fleeing poverty, lack of opportunity, civic dysfunction, or ecological threats. Altogether, about 244 million people today are living in countries they were not born in. This month, the most visible of the world's dislocated have been the Rohingya people of Myanmar. I'm going to butcher these poor words here, so just bear with me. They had numbered over 1.2 million in the nation where their families have lived for generations, but where they remain an unrecognized minority, legally, formally unrecognized. Some 430,000 Rohingya refugees have crossed the border into Bangladesh since the end of August. They're joining about 100,000 people who are already there because of previous waves of repression. The brutality being visited upon them is being described by the UN as a textbook example of ethnic cleansing. And once again, it is to another developing state, this time Bangladesh, where these people are being herded, where a developing state is being forced to absorb the burden of this sudden dislocation. But, you know, we get to castigate the Myanmar authorities, so we're covering ourselves. Though denied by the nation's de facto leader, the previously beloved Nobel Peace Prize winner Aung San Suu Kyi, the United Nations reports human rights abuses, including summary executions, sexual assaults, in what is apparently a coordinated repression. Something like 200 villages have been burned. Many of the Rohingya have lived in Myanmar for generations, yet they remain unintegrated and unaccepted by their countrymen, who insist on referring to them as Bengalis. Their statelessness contributes to the terrible suffering they have endured. They've been described as the most persecuted minority group in the world right now. Already about 1,000 deaths have been reported and hundreds of villages have been set to flame. What government stands up for these people? Who will protect them? Who is weeping for them? That statelessness, that vulnerability is repeated in other countries around the world among some 10 million people whose status in the land of their birth has remained, sometimes for generations, precarious or simply impossible to formalize. They become easy targets when social and economic tensions rise and political maneuverings by larger forces emerge. Muslims in the Central African Republic, people you're seeing here, likewise have been treated like foreigners and put to flight, even though some of them have lived, their families have lived there for 100 to 200 years. As have Christians, Turkmen, Yazidi communities in Syria and Iraq. Instead of the bold leadership one might have expected of her, and which frankly the humanitarian crisis demands, Aung San Suu Kyi has resisted international monitors and denounced reports of the repression as fraudulent. She has been carefully attentive not to offend the sensibilities of the nation's Buddhist majority and a too powerful military which still follows its own interests. The world has been united in condemning this ethnic cleansing and Aung San Suu Kyi's failure to curtail Myanmar's former junta leaders, though it is not clear if she really has the power to do so. But as humanitarian first responders on the ground in Bangladesh struggle to handle this humanitarian disaster unfolding before the world's eyes, has the international response to this crisis been any better than in the past? I guess in 5 or 10 years we'll have a committee and a commission to evaluate that, and they'll come up with a conclusion. Last year there was hope that the global community could do better. In May 2016, delegates concluding the first UN World Humanitarian Summit in Istanbul, Turkey, produced what has been called the Grand Bargain on the Treatment of the World's Refugees. Just a few months later at the UN General Assembly, 2016, in New York, the New York Declaration expressed the renewed commitment of world leaders to to save lives and to share responsibility for people put to flight by calamity or conflict. Like a number of other international reappraisals on the status of refugees, migrant people issued last year, the Declaration and the Grand Bargain augured a new approach toward a coordinated and equitable humanitarian response to refugee crises, with an emphasis on information and resource sharing, social integration of refugees with host communities, rapid and sustained assistance to host nations, transparency, and the conclusion of the refugees themselves in the decisions that would affect their lives. Last year, it was possible to be optimistic that the international community could indeed step up to that reinvigorated commitment to share the burden of a world of people on the move. But even as thousands of new refugees clamor to escape the repression in Myanmar, the ongoing conflict in Iraq and Syria, or to flee famine, poverty, and violence in Africa or Central America, nativist sentiment in both the United States and Europe is on the rise. And an abrupt turnabout on refugees and immigrants since the election of President Trump has changed the political landscape in Washington. This year, the grand bargain seems fragile, even as practical changes in strategies and protocols in the camps and settlements for IDPs, internally displaced people, I hate when they do those abbreviations, and refugees have fled for safety and assistance have indeed taken form. Speaking at a recent conference sponsored by Caritas Internationalis, which is the church umbrella organization for relief and development worldwide, Catholic Relief Services is the American component of that. As world leaders gathered at the UN General Assembly, Bill O'Keefe, Vice President for Government Relations and Advocacy at Catholic Relief Services, insisted that CRS and other refugee advocates were adjusting to the changing tone and policy out of Washington. According to Mr. O'Keefe, the obvious need for a more aggressive engagement with the public has accelerated an effort among humanitarian and relief agencies to better coordinate their outreach and advocacy. In the Catholic relief and development world, that public relations and spiritual offensive began yesterday. Do we have a representative here from Share the Journey? No? We do. Great. So Catholics here should pay attention. Your whole church, worldwide, is organizing to try and change the narrative on the treatment of refugees and migrants around the world. This is sponsored not just by Caritas Internationalis, but by the Holy See, Catholic Relief Services here in the United States, and good old Papa Francesco is behind this. So this is going to be an ongoing global and advocacy and education campaign to raise awareness and to change what has become the prevailing narrative on refugees, one of fear and suspicion. Mr. O'Keefe says he wants to get the message out to the American people that refugees are not the problem. The people they are running away from are the problem. The United States and other world powers, he says, have a responsibility to respond when lives are at risk because of conflict or other crises that force migration. It's not clear that people in Washington today agree. All the same, Mr. O'Keefe is confident that his renewed outreach will be quickly rewarded by a return to a more welcoming attitude toward refugees. This is what he told me last week, anyhow. I think he'll have his work cut out for him. President Trump has made containing migration, whether from the Middle East or Central America or Africa, the centerpiece of his policy agenda. In 2016, the last year of the Obama presidency, the United States accepted 85,000 refugees. It was a bit of a boost from the previous year. The next year, President Obama had proposed that the number would be increased to 110,000. A good number of those people were expected to come from Syria. President Trump reduced the quota last year, or this fiscal year, to 50,000 from the 110 that Obama was seeking. Yesterday, he announced that 50,000 was still too high, and now he wants it to be 45,000 for next year. There are 17.2 million people in the world today who are refugees. So, and that number has increased 7% from the year before. And we're going to take in 45,000 people. More than 14.5 million refugees, 85% of the global total, are hosted in developing nations that can barely afford to take care of their own people. These are the states least able to shoulder the burden. A growing resistance to what's called secondary movement. That is, if you are a refugee in Jordan or Lebanon or Turkey or Kenya, and you've been there a few years and you've done all your paperwork and you've registered with the UNHCR, and you want to move on with your life, and you're tired of sitting in a camp and you don't think you're ever going to get a chance to go home, this would be a third-party resettlement. They call it secondary movement. That would be to Europe or the United States usually, or Australia. You may have noticed that there has become a growing resistance in those areas to that sort of acceptance of those refugee numbers. This would be to wealthier, stable nations that are more capable of accepting the financial and social burden of assisting refugees. States that might even benefit from that influx of refugees. Particularly maybe Europe, where they have a 1.2 repopulation rate. This resistance is in fundamental defiance of the responsibility sharing envisioned by the Grand Bargain. Last year, Turkey and Germany were the only group of 20 nations among the world's top 10 refugee hosting nations. Citing fears of terrorism, fueled by the Middle Eastern destabilization its policies and decisions have propelled, the United States has accepted responsibility for the tiniest fraction of this vast population. The quota proposed by the Trump administration would be a post-war low for the United States. Turkey currently hosts 35 refugees per 1,000 residents. Jordan hosts 89 refugees per 1,000. Lebanon hosts 173 per 1,000. The rate offered by the president would be less than 1 refugee per 1,000 people here in the United States. The new U.S. quota represents a unique shirking of its responsibilities as a global leader. That leadership, of course, can work both ways. Other affluent states will no doubt follow the Trump administration's lead, leaving frontline countries currently hosting millions of refugees, especially those around Syria, struggling with what should be a shared global obligation. Cut off from resettlement sites, unable to go home, refugees may wait years in a legal, bureaucratic limbo. Although wait times vary dramatically depending on the individual crises, the average wait for formal resettlement now is 25 years. It's a lifetime of waiting. It's no surprise that many people have unofficially resettled themselves in safe harbor third nations, away from conflict zones and unwelcoming host nations. That unmet resettlement demand feeds a vast criminal human trafficking enterprise and throws the most vulnerable of the world's migrants, women and children, into a stark danger. Children are growing into adulthood in camps now, or as part of families that have left camps and resettled themselves in the urban zones of their host nations, where they face a near impossible challenge of legally finding jobs that can provide a family a sustainable income and find a way to get their kids to get an education when they are often cut off from school enrollment because of their status. Refugee children are 5 times more likely to be out of school than non-refugee children. Less than 2% of all humanitarian funding is directed toward education. This is something the Jesuit Refugee Service is particularly focused on. I'll give them a quick plug, as I work for the Jesuits as well. They made it a special mission of theirs to respond to this education crisis among refugee children. They believe getting refugee children back into a classroom as quickly as possible is good therapy for the kids, considering the chaos and anxiety of their lives, and it's good preparation for the future, since clearly a lot of these kids are not going anywhere. They need to be ready to make a go of their lives in their host nations, or if indeed they get resettled somewhere, or if, God willing, they actually return to their home societies. And those societies will probably need a great deal of restoration and rebuilding when they get there. Back closer to home, the United States is a protagonist in its own migration drama. It's still viewed as a beacon of hope by thousands seeking to escape poverty, civic dysfunction, and gang and government-sponsored violence in Central America. The region's huddled masses converge at the U.S. border with Mexico, a pile-up of human misery, typified in recent years by the phenomenon of the unaccompanied minor, as children as young as 6 years old find their way north, seeking to reunite with parents or older siblings who have already crossed over into the United States. The president promises a vast reinforced wall on the border to keep these people out, these unaccompanied children. among them. And within our borders, immigration enforcement policies have become more and more aggressive, stalking undocumented people outside church-run homeless shelters, courts, and hospitals. Refugee freezes, outright bans, and walls of paperwork keep those attempting to escape the violent and unstable Middle East from reaching safety here in the United States. What of it, many Americans ask? Why should we be responsible for the world's problems? Why should America run the risk of accepting these people on the move, whether they're escaping ISIS in Iraq or criminal gangs in Central America? It's not our fault. In truth, a great deal of it is our fault. Directly attributable to policies or appetites here in the United States. After over a decade of disintegrating regional conditions in the Middle East, it's hard to argue that the decision to invade Iraq in 2003 was not criminally wrong-headed. And follow-up policies only contributed to the spread of disorder and violence throughout the region. High demand in the United States for drugs, methamphetamine, heroin, cocaine, that helps propel the disorder in Central America. Since the 1980s, the region has also been liberally seeded by the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement Bureau, deporting criminal gang members from Los Angeles back to Central America. I shouldn't say back to Central America. Most of them grew up here. They learned the gang culture here, and then we shipped them to Central America, where they've been busy the last 20 years destabilizing their communities and governments, and creating a level of street violence that is driving people north to safety. So as a matter of geopolitical ethics and basic decency, the United States must accept some responsibility for the collateral damage policies like these have created and the migration they have provoked. Beyond that geopolitical obligation, there is a moral call. Still, some of us still respond to the moral call, so we'll try to make it. To assist those in distress. It's recognized by all religions. It's enumerated in Scripture and church doctrine. But it's perhaps best and most affectionately summarized for Christians in the parable of the Good Samaritan. It's one much beloved here among American Christians. So why have so many Americans who so frequently insist on the nation's Christian identity turned out to be unwilling to accept the scriptural role of the Good Samaritan to the world's migrants and refugees? In truth, we've really never been good at that. If you look back at surveys going back to World War II, Americans have always resisted the idea of being a way station for refugees escaping violence, or immigrants coming here for any sort of reason. In the past, though, the government has had to dig deep and override public sentiment against refugees and immigrants. And immigrants themselves have had to sometimes literally fight their way into American society. So what we're experiencing, I don't know if it's encouraging to hear, it's nothing new. This has been going on for a long time. We do seem to inhabit an acutely unfriendly period of time here in the United States, however. I don't know if has anyone seen the video of George Bush and Ronald Reagan during the 1980 Republican primary? It's been circulating on the internet. Anyone seen it? Damn, I really wish I brought that with us. All right, you'll have to take my word for it. Look for it on YouTube when you get home. Back in 1980, these two Republicans, one who is revered as sort of a saint within the political ethos of the GOP, are debating what to do about America's undocumented population. I think at the time it was maybe measured at 5 or 6 million people, mostly from Mexico. You might be surprised to hear them talk about this. They seemed to struggle to outdo each other in compassionate conservatism, vying to discuss even more humane ways to deal with the problem than the other. George Bush, the elder, told this Republican primary audience to great applause what the nation was doing wrong regarding its undocumented population. We're doing two things, he said. We're creating a whole society of really honorable, decent, family-loving people that are in violation of the law. And secondly, we're exacerbating relations with Mexico. That's what we were doing wrong, he would say. Not to be outdone in welcoming the sojourner, and with an eye on both practical and humane border policy, candidate Reagan, the beloved Ronald Reagan, told the audience, also to much generous applause, "I think the time has come for the United States and our neighbor to the south that we should have a better understanding and a better relationship than we've ever had. He said the United States, this was, to me was a key insight of his, has not been sensitive enough to its size and power. Citing Mexico's high unemployment, at the time 40%, Reagan suggests it is only in the self-interest of the United States to serve as the employment safety valve for the hemisphere, lest poverty and disorder lead to another Cuba right on our border. He notes that the politicians of his era were talking about putting up a bigger border wall. Instead, Reagan suggests, why don't we work out some recognition of our mutual problems and make it possible for them to come here legally with a work permit? Those workers, he reasons, could live and work and pay taxes in the United States and go back and forth as they please. I think we could have a fine relationship with Mexico, he said. Fine relationship. That welcoming sentiment, one that didn't scapegoat or demonize, but asked what was necessary, what was practical, and what was humane to respond to this mutual dilemma, it's almost impossible to imagine today coming from a Republican Party candidate. What has changed so dramatically over the last 37 years? Why have we forgotten how to weep? Compare that attitude to the exasperated indifference of Steve Bannon last week, 2 weeks ago, a cradle Catholic who explains that he's willing to listen to U.S. Catholic bishops on matters of doctrine, presumably measurements of incense and candle height, but not on matters of immigration and refugee resettlement. That's got nothing to do with Catholic doctrine, he tells America with a straight face. In one sense, he's absolutely correct, because the Church's teaching on welcoming the sojourner, caring for the refugee, showing hospitality to the migrant is actually something much deeper than doctrine. It is moral instruction embedded in Scripture. We remember that the Jews were once exiles in Egypt, and that few of our forebears have escaped a similar exile of their own. It's part of the reason so many of our parents, grandparents, or great-grandparents came to America. Leviticus instructs, the alien who resides with you shall be to you as the citizen among you. You shall love the alien as yourself, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. It's a reminder to all contemporary Americans of parents who fled their own pharaohs. Remember, too, the refugee flight of the Holy Family into Egypt. It has become a bit of a cliche to ask, but were the Holy Family to move across the earth today, would we recognize them? Would we recognize them attempting to escape from Syria or Honduras to Europe or the United States? Are Border Patrol agents and ICE officers even now searching for this newborn king as they round up scores of innocent children and their undocumented parents? Jesus reiterates the Old Testament command to love and care for the sojourner, the widow, and the orphan. These are the criterion by which we will be judged. These have become what we call the corporal works of mercy, which I believe is the theme of this lecture series. Now, the beauty of the corporal works of mercy, if you're working with refugees and migrants, is you can get it all done in one fell swoop. It'll be done for your life, and you can just move on to being a jackass again. Clothe the naked, feed the hungry, bring water to the thirsty, shelter to the homeless. You're done. Well, you have to go to prisons, visit a prisoner, and a hospital. Okay, but then you'd be done. Paul asserts the absolute equality of all people before God. There is neither Jew nor Greek, but you are all one. You are all one in Jesus Christ. In Christ, the human race is one before God, equal in dignity and rights. At the same time, the Church does teach that nations indeed have a right to regulate their borders, patrol their borders, protect their borders as they see fit. But what the Church says is that right is not absolute. That right must bow before mercy and justice. People have a right to migrate, and not just when their personal safety is threatened, as when the Holy Family fled the cruelty of Herod. Flight is justified and refuge required by host states, even when it's compelled only by the need to put bread on the family table. That's a hard thing for us to hear in this country. We love to dismiss economic migrants, even if they aren't really economic migrants. Maybe they're people fleeing violence in Honduras or Guatemala. The native born, according to church teaching, do not have superior right to life over the immigrant. The earth was given by God to all, and before God all are equal. The earth was given by God to all, and before God, all are equal. When a person cannot achieve a meaningful life in his or her own land, a life that guarantees their dignity and the future of their children, that person has the right to move. And I'm sorry, Mr. Bannon, but that is church doctrine. The church also teaches that people have the right not to migrate, and I think this is one that we constantly screw up on and fail as Americans. Many people making the perilous journeys out of the Middle East or Central America would prefer to stay in their homelands if conditions were improved enough to allow that. A commitment to achieving that should be balanced against the resources expended on efforts to keep migrants out or deport them when they have arrived. So why are we European descent Christians doing such a god-awful job of living up to scriptural injunctions in our own social teaching? Fear is a large part of it, of course. Especially the near delusional terrors stoked by the round-the-clock news that cable TV and the internet have so unwholesomely delivered into our lives. Turn it off. Turn it off. You won't regret it. Certainly the fact that so many migrants and refugees in recent years come from Middle Eastern states plays some role in this rising hostility and suspicion and failure of imagination. The otherness of Muslims, simmering resentment for 9/11, the purported threat of Sharia law and population jihad, those things sell subscriptions to demographic doomsayers on the internet, and they have in turn a real effect on public policy. In Charlottesville, alt-right and neo-Nazi demonstrators chanted, "You will not replace us." In Europe, where natives are birthing babies far below a minimum replacement rate, that anxiety of replacement, that demographic apocalypse, warps public sentiment and public policy on refugees. We've become a first world of consumers, not parents, and it has made us spiteful and cold-hearted. Whites in America are struggling in fits and starts, maybe more fits than starts. That was a joke. But that one would connect. No? Okay. Should have listened to my wife. Okay. Whites are struggling to understand their place in a changing society where their numerical superiority and the privilege that historically conferred can no longer be taken for granted. A wave of refugees from the Middle East and Africa only feeds this white anxiety about being overtaken and diminished in the nation's non-white future. There'll still be a plurality, guys, so just relax. These anxieties seem to reach crescendo at perhaps the worst possible historic moment, given the gravity of the world's migration crisis. We like to think about progress, especially racial progress, as something running along an unstoppably positive curve, the arc of the universe bending and all that stuff. But according to some psychologists, this current generation of white America is not only just as racist as previous generations, it is demonstrably more racist or more susceptible to racist triggers. Why should we be surprised when social and international policy, even public policy governing humanitarian response, begins to reflect that unfortunate reality? And I think economic insecurity must also play some role in our nation's lack of hospitality. American workers no longer expect to do as well as their parents, and they don't have confidence that they can deliver a better future to their kids, even get them through college any longer. And I'm sure your parents, a lot of your parents are wondering that right now. Those fortunate to go to college in the current economy are graduating and entering the workforce with lower salary expectations and mortgage-sized student loan debt that will take decades, perhaps lifetimes, to resolve. 76% of Americans today are living paycheck to paycheck. 76%. They have little to no emergency savings. Almost a third of us have no savings at all. That economic stress does two things. It sends us out looking for someone to blame, and it makes us greedy to preserve our resources, fearful to be generous. How can we open our doors to even the most deserving, properly vetted of newcomers, when we can barely keep a roof over our heads? We don't weep for the children at our borders, we're reserving our tears for our own children. So, what is to be done? How do we break down a narrative of fear and menace and replace it with a narrative of solidarity and hope? Given the proclivities of our current leadership in Washington, perhaps mere stasis over the next few years will seem like some kind of victory. The U.S. Church and the U.S. bishops seem to be stepping up their game in recent months on this subject, goaded into action by the horrific Bannon and the terrifying idea factory of the Trump administration. There have been a number of direct pushbacks against the Trump administration on the treatment of refugees and undocumented people among us, and the more aggressive practices of the Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The church does sponsor large-scale media campaigns like Justice for Immigrants and the global campaign we've already talked about. But how effective are such efforts in reaching Catholics and helping them wake up from the 24-hour cable news trance they've fallen into? Too often bishop statements digitally fade away on the internet, or they get misplaced on rectory kitchen tables without ever reaching the consciousness of people in the pews. The people who do the voting, people who write the campaign checks that lead to real-world policy. Instead, we Catholics get to hear scoldy sermons on abortion and religious freedom, pushing for more of us finally, for God's sake, to go to confession, or pressuring us to sign a check for the latest Cardinal's appeal or the air conditioning in the parish hall. I'm on the parish council, so you might have seen it being here. But how many of us have ever heard a homily that bluntly deplored xenophobia or Islamophobia, or that attempts to share some of the real stories of the world's real refugees, to humanize them a little, to break down the barriers to more generous policies on resettlement? Beyond the scriptural foundation for humane treatment of migrating people, the Church, since the beginning of the 20th century, has released a parade of apostolic letters and exhortations calling attention to the plight of the migrant and urging relief of their suffering. At the end of World War II, that attention was still primarily fixed on the suffering of Christian migrants. But this Pope has made perfectly clear that he believes that Christian responsibility to protect the migrant and the refugee extends to people of all faiths and all nationalities, or people of no faith or no nationality, the stateless people we talked about. He calls for bridges, not walls, whether they are literal walls or the walls of bureaucracy or legalities. He even suggests that this global crisis of encounter should be viewed as a great opportunity, a great blessing. This is on his mind so often, so frequently, I didn't even have to look more than to last week to get some quotes from him on this. Last week he specifically admonished Catholics to be better Christians. Catholics to be better Christians. He felt obliged to remind pilgrims gathered at St. Peter's that the Catholic community in many countries has been enriched and blessed by Catholics arriving from other countries, contributing in a real way to the local experience of the universal church, improving their societies, benefiting their countries. He said with the arrival of migrants and refugees belonging to other religions, or no religion at all, today, Catholics have an opportunity to witness concretely to the Christian faith through charity and with profound respect for other religious expression. The encounter with migrants and refugees of other confessions and religions, he said, is fertile ground for the development of a sincere and enriching ecumenical and interreligious dialogue. It could be a lot more than that. Perhaps it is a dialogue born out of mercy and generosity that can help the Islamic and Christian worlds unravel themselves from this clash of civilizations we seemed doomed otherwise to pass on to another generation. This crisis, as the Pope says, could be a gift of encounter and mercy. It could change the historical narrative we've been doomed to follow. What is to be done? Accept more refugees. Push for comprehensive immigration reform that gets close to Reagan's idea without creating new opportunities for exploitation of guest workers. Honestly live up to existing frameworks on migration and refugee status. That means people escaping violence in Central America should be treated as asylum seekers, not economic migrants. Modify those frameworks as necessary to meet today's realities, not 1945's. And for God's sake, at a bare minimum, we should not deport people back to their deaths, which we have done on multiple occasions in the last few months. Be more generous. Send the resources host nations need and seek international agreement on the treatment and sustenance of long-term refugee populations. If they had access to education for their children, a decent, normalized shelter, an opportunity for work, to not only put food on their tables, but also keep their skill set sharp, with so many refugees growing listless and frustrated in camps or exploited by gray market employment in developing world cities, Would they be pressing to leave for third-party resettlement? Maybe they might be more inclined to stay close to their homes in the hopes of one day returning with dignity and security to their own communities. Let's also remember the Church's wisdom on the right not to migrate. U.S. citizens are being asked to swallow hard to finance our Great Southern Barrier. I've seen estimates that the Great Wall, the transparent, translucent wall that the President proposes, could cost anywhere between $12 and $40 billion. In 2016, the total amount of money that U.S. economic and development aid that went to help stabilize and create opportunity in Central America, anybody want to guess what it was? We're willing to spend $12 billion on a wall. What do you think we were going to spend to help develop the economies, improve civic life in Central America? $135 million. And that's including aid for security. So it's not even pure economic aid. Can you imagine what the United States could do to promote economic development or shore up communities disrupted by free trade agreements in Mexico and Central America with just a fraction of that wall money, or the billions we now spend on immigration enforcement? We are willing to take terrific risks and make vast investments for war making and law enforcement in our society. We should be as willing to do the same for mercy and peace and justice. Most of all, what is to be done before any of these large and costly policy shifts can take place is our own personal conversion, to learning how to weep again, to break free within our hearts from this globalization of indifference. There is cause for hope. Good people around the world are working to make the grand bargain a reality. Peace has come to Colombia this year. That could be the beginning of the end for the world's largest crisis of dislocated people, 7 million people. That would take a giant chunk out of that 66 million. It won't happen overnight, it'll take years, but this could be the beginning. Just 3 countries in the world account for 55% of the world's refugees. Syria alone represents 1/3 of them. So progress on ending the conflict in Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Syria alone would make an enormous difference. And despite the apparent mishigash of our times, I'm sorry, that was a New York Yiddish word, craziness of our times, as white supremacists increasingly feel comfortable sharing their odious beliefs out loud, and as their marches and demonstrations claim all the media eyeballs, in the background, actual Americans have been growing increasingly tolerant of migrant people, and they want our country to do more to assist refugees. According to Pew Research, in a survey conducted before last year's general election, so God knows how that experience might have poisoned the results now, but 6 in 10 Americans, 63%, say immigrants strengthen the United States because of their hard work and talents, while 27% still say that immigrants are a burden on the country because they take jobs, housing, and health care. That is a complete inversion of the results from 20 years ago. 20 years ago, 60% said they were a burden, and about 30% said they were a benefit. So despite all the craziness we're hearing, there seems to be something else happening in the background that's not getting as much attention. According to a Brookings survey last year, 60% of Americans supported accepting properly vetted refugees from the Middle East, despite the travel ban and all the other hysteria. And in the past, we have been very generous as a people to refugee communities. After the Second World War, more than 400,000 refugees were admitted, and between 1980 and 1990, 590,000 refugees from Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were allowed entry into the United States. That was a mea culpa for what we did there. And I think we owe the Middle East a mea culpa right now. During his Mass in Lampedusa, don't worry, I'm winding it up now, this is it. It's taking a lot longer than either of us thought it would. During the Mass in Lampedusa, the Pope observed a moment of great lamentation from the Bible, when Rachel weeps for her children because they are no more. Herod, like us, is unable to weep for the destruction that he authors. This is what the Pope said, and I just love this sentence. Let us ask the Lord to remove the part of Herod that lurks in our hearts. Let us ask the Lord for the grace to weep over our indifference. We have become used to other people's suffering. It doesn't concern us. It doesn't interest us. It's none of our business. That's what he warned at Lampedusa. Of course, it does concern us, it should interest us, and it is our business if we are who we say we are. St. John Paul II said that solidarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortune of others. It is a firm determination to commit oneself to the common good, to the good of all and of each individual. Solidarity is not a mere reflexive sorrow about or even empathy with the suffering of other people. Solidarity is an obliteration of the other altogether. It is a spiritual and political place where there is no refugee, there is no migrant, there is no native born, there is no citizen, there is no undocumented. There is only an us that recognizes and cherishes the interdependence of all humanity. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Kevin. Giving us a lot to work with. Our program moves forward. I'd like to welcome Mutsa to the podium to give us a starting off point for reflection and conversation. We'll have a brief report on the new initiative that Kevin made mention of. So please join me in welcoming Mutsa Muhammad.
Wow, thank you so much, Kevin. It's really hard to follow up on that. That was really informative and really a broader overview of what has been going on. And so in my 5 minutes or less, briefly, I am a student here at DePaul. I'm in the Refugee Studies and Post-Migration program. I'm in the second cohort. It's a new program, but it's really exciting and in the sense that it's timeless. You know, everything on the news and what's going on in the world really kind of is brought into class every single day. What I want to talk about a little more is about statelessness, which Kevin brought up, and which is sad to say in the throes of all of the migration crises, in parentheses I'd like to put them, but I mean the movement of people, statelessness is on the rise. And it's something that we need to kind of be mindful of in light of the development and population growth in regions. For instance, in Africa as a whole, there's a projection that by the end of the 22nd century, the population in Africa, where I am from, will almost equal that to Asia. And right now, a lot of statelessness is kind of rampant in there. Hi, Professor Muslim. And it's important that we address this, why we should care. By 2100, Africa will, if the UN projections bear out, account for almost 40% of the world's 11.2 billion population. But right now, Africa is the continent that's sending out the most in terms of refugees into the world. And the scope of statelessness in Africa is a protracted problem. The causes of statelessness are linked to so much of what we originally were known for. We're nomadic people, and our borders were established in the late 19th century at the Berlin Conference, and to this day, so many people are unaccounted for. So many people, when I say unaccounted for, have no state that recognizes them as their citizens. And as a result, they have limited access to resources. They're the ones that are more prone to take those daring trips across the Mediterranean in order to hopefully get some recognition abroad. Countries in Africa with over 10,000 stateless persons right now include Cote d'Ivoire, Zimbabwe, Kenya, DRC, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Madagascar, South Africa, and there is no common defined path to citizenship, which is much needed. Closer to home, we have the undocumented individuals, and with undocumented individuals, most of them do have roots where they can trace that they're coming from, but in the throes of it, they've been here for a long time, and they need their own path. They need for them to contribute meaningfully and to develop the economy more. They need that recognition. Recognition is priceless. Recognition is development in the third world. And I say that in the sense that with people settling down and having peace of mind, they're more prone to go forth and send remissions back home confidently. They are more likely to invest back home, and that releases the burden on the global north, because they themselves will be building their own nations back home. And at the end of the day, we've learned that when we have handouts, or give handouts to a greater extent, it's not as long-lasting as if when locals themselves come up with solutions. So statelessness and migration has a nexus and can cause persons are often marginalized and discriminated against when they try to access the most basic services. And it's really difficult to differentiate a stateless person from a refugee or an immigrant or an economic migrant. There is no special hat that they wear that differentiates them from the other. It's only upon asking them for documentation, more likely than not, that you will realize that this person has no state that claims them as their own. They're called the irregular aliens in most countries. And why is that? And it's because a lot of countries fail to establish rules and policies that play fair in allowing children born to have some sort of identity right away. We have certain conventions that are out there that help, but not all countries are signatory to them, and more likely have not ratified them. For instance, we have the Convention on the Child, CRC, Convention on the Rights of the Child, and Article 7 of it speaks on children's rights to the nationality, children's right to a name. But we still see that 9 out of 26 countries, 9 out of 27 nations that discriminate against women deny the child that very right. If your child is born within the countries of Swaziland, Somalia, Liberia, Libya, Mauritania, Madagascar, Burundi, Sudan, Sierra Leone, and Togo, and the father is unknown, that child is more likely than not to end up being stateless. So wrapping it up and coming back to Kevin's presentation and trying to intertwine it with what I just briefly shared, the church has been called time and time again to rally up and help however possible to reduce or mitigate or come up with plausible solutions. But at the end of the day, it's really at the individual. And there's a saying that says, how do you eat an elephant? And it's one bite at a time. And usually it starts at your dining table. It usually starts with the conversation you're having. And do you know what a refugee looks like? Do you know what a stateless person looks like? Would you want to walk a mile in their shoes? Putting yourself in their place is the first step in resolving this. Thank you.
Good evening. My name is Beth Kenobi. I'm one of the regional representatives for Catholic Relief Services working out of our Chicago office. And I'm just so grateful for our partnership with DePaul University, working on both our faculty learning commons resources for raising awareness about migrants and refugees this year. Really headed up by Charles Strain from the Religious Studies Department, who helped to co-author a book about migrants and refugees this year, as well as a really strong presence of student ambassadors helping to lead the charge of raising awareness among students. I don't know if Mateo or Janessa are here tonight representing our student ambassadors, but are really grateful for their support as well. And as Kevin so wonderfully articulated throughout his remarks tonight, yesterday Pope Francis launched the Share the Journey campaign on behalf of all of Caritas Internationalis, which is represented here in the United States by Catholic Relief Services, Catholic Charities USA, and the USCCB through Refugee and Migration Services. There's some handouts in the back if you're interested in how you might be involved in the campaign. You can certainly follow the hashtag ShareJourney on any of your social media accounts, or check out the website sharejourney.org. But really the purpose of the campaign is to change the narrative, as Kevin said, that really the only way that we can change the narrative is by lifting up the stories of migrants and refugees, by encountering them locally and telling their stories globally. I think one of the two things that really strike me, one is how often Pope Francis quotes Jesus in saying, "Do not be afraid." And in his remarks yesterday, he said, "Do not be afraid of migrants and refugees. Do not be afraid of sharing hope." And the other story I always go back to is the image of a woman that our staff met, an Iraqi teacher that we met in a bus depot in Serbia with her little boy, and in very broken English she said, "All I want is for life to be beautiful. I want a beautiful life for me and my family." And who could want anything more from people desiring to be able to live in a safe place in their own homes, or to find refuge in another country, to have a beautiful life. So really do invite all of you, whether you are faculty or students or parishioners or concerned community members, to please share the journey with all of us and tell the stories of people who are seeking a beautiful life. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. We have a microphone here. We are recording the session, so if you would please move to the center aisle, move up to the microphone stand and ask your question, and we can form a line in the aisle behind there. So the floor is open.
Hi, I was wondering if that quota on U.S. refugees, is that solely in the power of the president to set, or is there anything that you would advise for people to do politically to at least express displeasure with that?
I think I could be wrong about this. I'm not an expert on the ways of Washington. I believe it is the discretion of the President and the State Department to set the quota each year. I don't think there's a law that requires a certain number of people. It's always been fairly fluid. It almost never dips below about 70,000. It's been between 60 and 80,000 over the last 10 or 15 years, I think. Michael, would that sound right to you?
I think so. It started in 1980.
And you know, the question is, in this time with such an acute crisis, shouldn't it be lifted way higher than the normal numbers? And that's what Obama was starting to do. Perhaps he should have had more momentum. He could have done it a few more years before he left office. And the expectation was this year would be almost doubled, or, well, not like 30 or 40% more. And instead we've gone the opposite way. We've gone down 30 or 40%. We're getting out to levels that haven't been seen since the end of World War II.
But I guess, is there any advocacy step for
Well,
it,
the same
or is it
advocacy
kind
you
of
can do
hopeless?
about any State Department policy or presidential policy. I believe you can complain to your congressional representatives to put pressure on them. You could start a letter writing campaign. The normal stuff you can do to raise. I think the primary thing is to make sure people are aware of this issue. That in a world where 17 million refugees are, suffering and struggling, we are willing to take 45,000. And as much as you might, deride the government in Turkey or some of these other countries, they're handling millions of refugees, and they're paying for millions of refugees. I think we've kicked in about $5 billion. I think Turkey is spending $10 billion a year to host the Syrian refugees. And they are not in the position to spend that kind of money the way we are. We're a much more affluent society.
It is the President's discretion with the consent of Congress. It's supposed to be the advice of Congress, but it really is the President's discretion. And I just heard some religious groups starting a Twitter storm yesterday on this thing to the Congress and the President about higher numbers of refugees. So I can send it to Mike if you want that link.
Well, see, now I'm so out of it that I wouldn't even have thought of just starting a Twitter storm. Let's get a paper and start a petition.
I just saw it today.
Thank you. Thank you for being more hip to the square than I am.
I have a question about something you said. You said that people, once people are threatened, they begin to protect their privileged lifestyle. Is it proper to assume that when once people are threatened, they may like a spiritual awakening within themselves, or they may not really know God? They may in order, because when you display the xenophobia against unknown, you feel like you are privileged, or you like the spiritual concern for other people. You may preach the gospel of love, but you may not display it. Instead, you become like the Pharisees. You become more godly. You become more spiritual. You preach the gospel, but you don't live by showing concern for your brother man. But yes, I mean, I hope I made myself.
I think I got you. I think when we get, like, the gospel is hard to live by under the best of circumstances, right? It's terrifying. It's a giant challenge to be a Christian, I think. I'm a terrible Christian. I don't do a very good job of it. And when people feel threatened by circumstances, they close in on themselves. This is why Pope Francis is always talking about going out, going out, going out. Open the doors. Go to the peripheries. Be the field hospital to the world. He knows what's going on. People are scared. They're scared by the economic circumstances they're in. They're scared by the changing society around them. And they're closing in. They're closing off from each other. They're closing off from communities within their own societies, and they're closing off to communities outside. Is that particularly a white problem?
No, not
possibly. No, I'll cop to it. You know, as much as I can speak for white people, I think there's a lot of fear out there. I think this country is changing very quickly, and you know, we've all been raised. At least I was, because I'm older than a lot of people, in a Leave It to Beaver kind of world, and that world is totally changing. It never existed in the first place. We were deluded, right? But I think that shift, the demographic shift, is happening faster than people realize. And what you see with people like Bannon and that ilk is shut the doors, close it down, stop it. Let's reverse. You know, let's change gears and go backwards. There's no going backwards, and that's what Pope Francis is saying. Let's move forward. Let's figure out a way to move forward together, and that's the great message that he has for us.
Thank you.
It is really good that you help the refugees who managed to flee poverty in other countries. How would you help the rest of the people who couldn't flee their country? Not only the children to get a good education, but also the young adults and adults who are jobless back there to get a good job.
Yeah, I think it's funny you should mention that. That is like the second thing that Pope Francis talks about all the time: youth unemployment. I think he has a perception there that is very wise and unique. He sees a world coming where youth employment for a lot of people is going to be a giant problem. And it's not just because of competing populations of lower income people around the world. It's going to be technology. It's going to be putting a lot of us out of work. And we are not even remotely ready for that world where there are fewer workers necessary for some of the jobs, or for some of the commodities and needs that we have. So
but back in their countries, those people who couldn't flee, what would you do?
Well, I think I talked a little bit about having more judicious investments.
At the back of the room is Sue Horgan that I want to recognize from Exodus World Service. And if you want to know what you can do, you can talk to Sue. Exodus World Service works with refugees here in Chicago. And they partner with churches, they partner with my church. And what they do is welcome people with welcome packs. And so you can contribute monetarily, you can help welcome people when they arrive. You can do with the New Neighbor program, my family and I did that, where we were paired up with a Rohingya family, a Muslim family. We have 3 boys, they have 3 boys. They don't speak much English, we don't speak very much Rohingya. But we got together once a week and we laughed and played soccer and played. I mean, just simple little gestures that say, we're glad you're here. And that is what Exodus World Service does. So if you are wanting to know what you specifically can do.
People who couldn't come for whatever reason.
Yeah,
stay
yeah.
behind.
I think we can say
That might be another question, but please, if anybody is interested in that, I really want to
Catholic Relief
want to
Service has a
recognize
whole
thanks
way
to this
working on
program.
development.
Hi, as a non-Catholic, as a Methodist, one of the things I've noticed in this new political climate is that there are people who are, cradle Catholics, who are influencing policies in a very non-Catholic way, in a non-Christian, it's as if they, it doesn't make any sense to me. And I'm wondering, like, as the Catholic Church or as the Pope, like, they're like, well, the Pope can't tell me anything. And I'm like, that doesn't make any sense as a Methodist. And so,
You guys have a method.
yeah,
It's written down, it's pretty straightforward.
but I'm like, we revere the Pope. And all, like, how does that even,
Well, yeah,
how
I
does
think
that work?
you're talking about Steve Bannon.
And like,
He claims to revere the Pope, but
Santorum, and,
Oh, okay. There's been a, in the past there was the heresy of Americanism, which was that the church was fearful that Americans didn't want to have too much of a close tie. They wanted freedom of religion for all religions, and that was considered heresy at the early part of this 20th century. Now the new Americanism, the new heresy, is to elevate nationalism and elevate libertarianism and radical, rugged individualism to an idol, and make that the thing that you worship. And I think a lot of American Catholics have fallen prey to this. When we first came to the society, we were the outliers. We were the ones struggling for social justice. In a few generations, we became, top of the heap, and it changed the perspective for a lot of people. They started looking for ways to rationalize the status they had achieved, because they felt maybe they felt a little uncomfortable with it. Maybe they felt a little guilty about it. And they found new philosophers and theologies: libertarianism, objectivism, Ayn Rand. I'm not saying Paul Ryan's name. I didn't say his name. So then those things started to create noise in the signal. All right, so the signal's been getting weak. The signal's getting distorted, and magazines like mine and good old U.S. Catholic here in Chicago, which I still write for every month, they're trying to clear the signal on some of these things. It doesn't get to everybody.
What you say is so much truth, and the crisis is monstrous, and the lack of humanity is monstrous too. But I don't think creating this idea of division. Steve Bannon, I'm a conservative Catholic, but Steve Bannon doesn't talk for me. And I've done some research. As Barack Obama talked about bringing in 100,000, he specifically excluded Christians from Iraq as they were being slaughtered. Outside of this country, including the BBC, talks about the deporter-in-chief, Barack Obama, who deported in 2012 400,000 undocumented immigrants. And during his 8 years, he deported more than 2.5 million. Why is that not in your statistics? So you're dividing right here and now along your particular ideology. So what you're doing is you're putting your ideology ahead of the needs of hurting people. And that doesn't bring people together, and that doesn't save lives.
Good.
Well, I have to object to that. I don't consider myself a conservative. I don't consider myself a liberal. I'm a Catholic who lives in America. If a friend has a good idea from a conservative perspective, I'm happy to listen to it and see if it works. I am not here trying to win converts for Obama, who is no longer president. We're talking about the here and now. Now, I don't know if you told something that's true. I'll have to, the idea that Obama was allowing 100,000 people in and was excluding Christians from Iraq. I find that very hard to believe, and I would have to check that out. I'm just saying, you may be right, you may be wrong. I never heard that. I just want to flag that and say I'm not sure that's true. I am not carrying water for the Obama administration, which I hasten to point out is no longer in power. I had no mandate here to defend Obama. I was here to talk about the current refugee crisis. The president right now is Donald Trump. If it's divisive to point out that his policies are contrary to what my church is telling me, I can't help that. That's the reality.
Yes, ma'am. Could you step over?
Well, I just want to know, where do we buy your magazine at?
It's funny you should ask. America Magazine is online at americamagazine.org.
Okay.
You can order it there. I think we have copies kicking around all over the place.
On the chairs.
On the chairs. You're welcome to take one home and sign up there. I get 10% commission on every sale made. Just saying, in case anybody's wondering.
Take a moment and give a round of applause.